Good afternoon and welcome. It's Sean Rooney here, Chief Executive Officer of Leading Age Services Australia, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome LASA members, LASA affiliates and other stakeholders for this webinar to discuss the Aged Care Royal Commission. The purpose of today's presentation really is to provide our members with information around the Royal Commission regarding what to expect in the coming year and how to prepare your organisations in order to manage through this period successfully. Now, shortly we'll go through some introductions with the panel today and then also look at just a very brief update on where the Royal Commission is up to and hand over to the team at PricewaterhouseCoopers to walk us through insights from their experiences in working with other organisations in other Royal Commissions. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Hugh Harley from PricewaterhouseCoopers and also Jamie Spencer. Now on the screen at the moment you'll see some numbers there for technical support in case there's any issue you're experiencing with the webinar. You would have seen in the video at the start of the webinar the instructions around the question and answer functionality. If you could submit questions as we go through the function on the screen, and at a point we'll stop in the presentation and look to respond to those questions. So just very briefly with regards to the Royal Commission, the story so far is you see the dates and the activities that have been conducted by the commissioners up to the present time. We know most recently that the Commission will have its directions hearing on the 18th of January in Adelaide. That'll be the opportunity for the Commissioners to basically set out their plan to conduct the inquiry. And we also know that they've recently mentioned that there'll be a call for open submissions, most likely to happen in early January, with the view that general hearings will be conducted from February onwards. One thing to note, you'll see on the screen that the Commission has sent out a number of FAQs. If you're not already following those, please do, because this is where information is communicated by the Commission direct to all stakeholders, and that information does change relatively quickly. Just finally, before I hand over to our friends here at PricewaterhouseCoopers, I just want to remind everybody that the role that LASA is playing here is very much around advocating for a safe quality aged care system. That's what we all want, and we see the Royal Commission as the key role here is to be able to realise how best we can achieve that outcome, which is all about making the aged care system better. So this is our opportunity as an industry and indeed as a country to be able to realise that outcome. Notwithstanding that, as many of you would know, LASA has continued to maintain focus on a number of other issues that we need to get on with right now to make the system better. And you can see on the screen there's a number of things that we've been doing to support our members, most notably providing information around the Royal Commission, advice to our members in working through responses to the Royal Commission, and then a range of services that we've made available to our members across legal, communications, risk, strategy and governance. We'll also continue to participate in the public commentary, as you would expect from the voice of aged care. So I'll now hand over to our friends at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where they'll walk us through their presentation on the Royal Commission.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Hugh Harley, and the reason I'm here speaking to you this afternoon is because I've led PwC's response to the Royal Commission, both in terms of supporting our clients and also, of course, in terms of our own position in relation to the Banking Royal Commission. Jamie and I are delighted to be here. We've got a range of slides, but if I really cut to the chase about one key message for you to take away, it's that the single best explanation of why some institutions have done relatively well in the Banking Royal Commission and some have not is that those institutions that did best were those institutions which right at the start afforded the Royal Commission the respect and maturity that it deserved. I mean, to take the most obvious example of the big four banks, when they were asked for the initial response, effectively over the Christmas period, the initial 50-page submission, 2 got a relatively clean bill of health in terms of process. 2 got basically a go back and do it again response from the Royal Commission. And it was precisely those 2 that were on the back foot at the start that ended up on the back foot right at the end of the process. It's an obvious and basic point, but I just can't stress it enough. And of course, the trouble is that within those organisations, the fact that they were struggling to understand and respond to the Royal Commission's needs was as much a cultural issue as anything else. And you know, because of that culture, they couldn't see the challenges that they were walking into, the fact that they were, in a sense, setting themselves up for a fall. And of course, they were responding last year at exactly this time of the year, the same time that many of you have been asked to respond. And of course, it's been a long year, everyone's tired, there's all the distractions of Christmas, right? And that was seen as a justification in some ways. So I just can't stress enough, it's a basic point, but this will be the most important thing that you guys need to deal with over the coming year, right? And that accordingly, management attention, governance attention, resources, the willingness to get the right legal advice is absolutely paramount. And I know it's an obvious point, but precisely the reason that I am stressing it and saying it's the most important point is because after over 12 months of dealing with the industry on this stuff, I've absolutely come to the view that that is the most important point. So look, let me then turn to the first slide. I'm not going to go through all of this slide. The basic message from the slide is that the Royal Commission is going to go through an extensive data trawl, that is your Royal Commission, in exactly the same way as the Banking Royal Commission. They're going to go through an extensive data trawl and in turn out of that going to come to a view about what the target issues and targeted players need to be. You'll see the various things we've called out there. It's in a sense also a checklist for you guys in terms of thinking about where your Royal Commission is going to come from, just as the Banking Royal Commission did. Are you across your complaints and incidents report? Are you thinking hard about the governance structures and whether they are up to the demands of 2019, not the demands of 2015, the demands of 2019? Right? So that gives you a sense of the core way in which the Banking Royal Commission conducted its work. And the point is that clearly it has been seen as a very effective process. It's exceeded people's expectations about what was going to come out of it. And without a doubt, your Royal Commission is going to be following a similar sort of tried and true formula. The next slide I want to present really builds up to that first point that I was making. What are the critical things that you need to cover off at this stage? We've called out 6. The first is obviously, really from your point of view, what would success look like? What is the strategic objective that you're trying? Because this will be such a big deal, you need to have your whole organisation lined up behind you on this. And so unless you can articulate what you're trying to achieve here, the rest of the organisation is really going to struggle. The second point, obviously this is all about having the resources and being able to gear up quickly. Document management is a critical thing. It sounds very bread and butter, but actually because everything in your organisation is potentially discoverable here, knowing what is sitting out there in your organisation and understanding the process of reviewing and providing that to the Commission is critical. Communication plan is obvious, but again, when I look at those organisations in banking and financial services, insurance generally, there's a very clear delineation between those who are absolutely proactive, particularly in staff communication, versus and could see problems were coming and got on the front foot versus those that hoped it was going to go away. And the next point, obviously, those who are going to be right in the firing line in your organisation need substantial support. Again, one of the messages from the Banking Royal Commission is this is a very human process, right? That effectively the way in which the Royal Commission examines institutions is to examine individuals. And as always, those who are best prepared are those who are going to do best. And that's precisely how the Royal Commission in banking got a number of organisations onto the back foot. That is, conversely, I can think of one institution that had a very tricky issue where the person that was to represent them literally did nothing for 3 weeks but practice with QCs about how they were going to respond. Now, that's an extreme case, but it turned out to be a particularly effective strategy. And the final point is the whole point about being proactive. Where are your risks? Where do you think you need to engage the Royal Commission and get on the front foot? No one expects the world is perfect. People understand that issues are going to surface in this. And again, to build on the point about this being a very human process, you know, there's nothing like getting on the front foot and articulating that you understand this and you care about it and you want to be part of the solution to change the tone of your own dealings with the Royal Commission. So on that part, I'll now pass to Jamie.
Thank you. My name's Jamie Spencer. I'm a director at PwC and helping lead our aged care practice. And I just want to run over some of the components that I suppose that we see as part of responding and a theme and a flavour for doing that. I suppose firstly as part of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about trust, but part of your response should be to be open and transparent. Make sure you understand the issues, and we often talk about almost the permafrost layer that we have in management at times, that information that everything's okay, and certainly at times you need to dig in and have a look at what's going on across your organisation, really understand what is happening, but moreover with that have very much a perspective that we understand our business. We know what's going on, but we're also, you know, working on making it better and improving it. So our advice pretty much in this space is to be as open as you can be. Work collaboratively, as Hugh's alluded to, with good legal advice, but make sure you're responding in a way that helps your organisation grow, because that helps build trust. With regards to culture and communication, we believe that it's really good to get ahead of the game. We sort of sometimes do this too, you know, tightly and worry about the information we put out. I think particularly we'll see after Christmas and into the new year, there's a lot more opportunity for the media to get hold of some of the things that are going on with the Commission. Our thoughts would be that it's good to get out there and actually provide that information to your teams ahead. So they look to you first for the best information, rather than what might happen through general media and otherwise. From an operations perspective, and I think just reiterating again some of the words that Hugh said as well, is that this is difficult to do just, you know, on your own. And so, or getting somebody to do and respond and make the changes on top of their day jobs is going to be hard. And we often refer to this as, you know, fixing the plane while flying the plane. It's really difficult to do. So don't be afraid to reach out and get some help. There's some good people out there. And obviously we're sitting here with the team here that can support you as well. Quality, and I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges when we look at the questions that were sent out from the Commission to the top 100 providers, was, you know, clinical governance and benchmarks. And something that comes fresh to my mind, having a clinical background, is, you know, you have falls, but what's your benchmark? What are you doing about it, and how are you changing practice? And how does that relate back to things such as consumer-driven care? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. I think that's one of the bigger challenges that we've got with the way that we respond to the Royal Commission. And then when we look at emerging stronger, I think this is a real opportunity to become a learning organisation. You're spending and investing a lot of time in doing a response. I think part of this is also learning from that and taking the opportunity to build trust across your organisation as you go. What is trust? Well, I think there's a lot of elements to trust, and we hear it talked about a lot in society at the moment. I mean, my general rule of thumb around this is that, be open, be honest, be transparent, be contactable, have an open two-way dialogue. This becomes really important. And when you link it back to a communication strategy that is almost flooding your workplace with what's happening, so people look to you and also look to your leadership team about you setting the standard going forward. We're responding in this way because we believe this is the right thing to do.
I think one way to explain that is that in the Banking Royal Commission, authenticity went a long way, right? Those that clearly were trying to be constructive, were owning up to the issues in their own organisation, and were looking to the future, but in a realistic way. Those authentic individuals and organisations were the ones that tended to do best on the trust dimension, and hence overall through the Commission.
So we talked a little bit earlier about fixing the plane while flying the plane. I think it's really important to consider as part of this is that we really need some help and some advice in the right way. Obviously, our perspective is that you get that help through some good legal representation that provides the right advice, gets the balance right around how do you protect yourself as an organisation, but also be open and transparent as part of that. I think, responding to the Royal Commission alone, let alone the changes that are required with the new standards, needs a dedication that you mightn't necessarily have. And sometimes just asking somebody to do it as part of their day job, you'll get you'll get an outcome where it's not dedicated towards the amount of change that's required. So our advice is that you think about that, and certainly, as Hugh's alluded to and gone over a lot of these points already, documentation management, governance and structures become really important. Point 5 there around early issue identification and risk management. I think, we started that as well when we started off with the conversation this afternoon, was very much get to know your business, get to know what's happening. It's okay to have challenges. Moreover, the Commission will look for what you're doing about it and how you're responding and how you have a strong clinical governance set up. Support your team, and I think that gets into some of those points around witness preparation as the people get called towards responding as well. And include, data analysis. So, if we learn from what happened in some cases with the Banking Royal Commission, just dumping data on the doorstep of the Commission isn't the answer. They're actually looking for an understanding from you around knowing your business. So what are the challenges here? And I think, without reading these slides directly, from our perspective, there's, consumer value versus, your employee and your team, and how do you weigh up the two? And, when we look at this as, in the old terms of, if I put my old nursing hat on, it's releasing time to care. But, how do you balance that with consumer-driven care? And, also things such as, for example, allowing risk in your organisation because your residents want to have and do things differently and have choice in the care that is provided to them. So informed choice, and what does that look like? It's moving away from a lot of the task-based orientation that sometimes we have, and a movement towards that functional independence that we're looking for in our residents and improving care. So there's a lot of challenges there, and would encourage you to start looking at those in more detail because it is a change in the way that you do business now and the way that we provide care. So as part of this, I think, consistent engagement of various audiences and I think as part of that, having a single voice and crafting a compelling narrative around, what you're saying consistently to your teams. For me, this is very much about, having the open discussion. What do we want to be famous for? What are we here for? And what are we going to achieve? And certainly with an executive team or a leadership team, being clear on those points so that that is consistent amongst all of your teams and you're all on the same page. People hear a consistent message and that will resonate with them, and they'll continue to believe in that as well. That also allows people to have the leadership they need through what is going to be a fairly tough time over the next months while this commission is going out, and certainly while they mightn't be directly involved, they'll certainly be involved from the perspective of media and otherwise as well. And also, as part of this, I think, have a clear plan around your communication, and that's not just always pushing out information. Remember, communication should be two ways, and it should be personal, and you should be in front of people. Have a clear plan about how you're meeting with your teams and the touch points with them as well is all part of getting this right, and having that language that people understand. So part of this operations slide that we have here is really around, those different, I suppose, themes of consumer, our people and our services. And while, I suppose, we're going through great times of change, how do we focus on and maintain our focus on consumers? How do we also use this time to build trust in our teams? And also, from this, learn and build our capability of our services is essentially some of the key points that we're trying to get across.
Can we just go back to that slide? I suppose one point I'd make about this too, in the context of keeping the wheels moving and responding to the issues that come up, is that in the Banking Royal Commission, one of the differentiators was those organisations that were clearly being thoughtful about the issues and demonstrating that to the Commission and in terms of how they responded. Some tried to make announcements about their core business, which were seen to be appropriate to the mood and responding to the issues, but which were frankly pretty simple and obvious, and it just reinforced the message that they weren't being serious about really how deep these issues ran. So, it's clearly important in all of this to continue to keep your own business going and to be making changes, but avoid trying to make simplistic changes as well, because based on the experience of the Banking Royal Commission, this Royal Commission will probably see right through them.
Yeah, I agree, Hugh. I mean, obviously from the questions that have come out, if you look at them simply, you'll probably get the answers wrong. I think there's a lot in between that needs to be read around that leads you down a pathway of understanding your business and clinical governance. Which sort of leads us to this next slide that talks to this a little bit more. And, there's 5 really good points there around accountability, responsibility, your clinical strategy, effective and proactive risk management, being person-centred, and capability and culture. And for me, if there's probably one thing you take away from this slide, it's asking the so what. And often we have processes in place and we can say, well, look, we've got this clinical governance committee and they look at all this data and so forth as well. But you've really got to sit back and go, right, what's the purpose? Why are they there? What are they doing? How do they actually have the ability to change the care that's delivered and change my organisation, put it in a different direction? And, if you can't see that and if you're getting the same response that, we've got a process, well, process is not an outcome. So think about this and certainly think about clinical governance in the perspective of, what does it mean and how do I change and make care better? Some of that's around accountability, I get it, and some of it's around your clinical strategy. What do we want to be famous for? Really about being proactive in the way that you manage your business and what do you know. You can manage risks after the facts, that's great, but certainly you want to know what's happening now. Be very person-centred, and I think this continues not only to your residents but your own team as well. And we often in PwC talk about things such as pulse surveys and otherwise around how do you get the pulse of your organisation and keep an eye on that. and invest in your people and look at your culture. No one's ever came away and said, I invested too much in developing my capability of my people. Often when we do that, we find we get better outcomes and we have better strength in our clinical capability. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think some of the significant changes that we're seeing in the new standards are pointing towards stronger clinical governance, and certainly how do we look to benchmarks across the industry, and what do we, how do we apply those? There are a few out now, as we all know. So as part of this, I think, there's a real opportunity for providers to set the benchmark and really, as part of responding and going through the Commission, to say this is the standard that we accept and we expect. There's some real opportunities as part of the feedback through the Commission and otherwise to have a voice around our expectation of the federal government as well, and how it supports and provides those things that are going to help providers going forward. I'd certainly encourage people to take that opportunity and how they, build their capabilities of their people and governance through that. So a couple of last slides, and we're nearly out of time because I wanted to give us some time to go through some questions as well. But just reiterating, I suppose, some key points around key controls. How do you know and what do you know about your incidents and your risks? Remember that sometimes risks and incidents are a latent way of understanding what's actually going on in your business. Leads to your governance and culture, and if you've got an open culture in your organisation, people will raise issues because they feel supported in doing that. Obviously, making sure your boards have oversight to that quality and safety and are helping drive that as well. Look at how you incentivise behaviours and change behaviours of your employees in the right way. And I often link that into, have you got a plan around developing your team, and can they see those goals that are, over the next 6, 12, 18 months that they need to achieve, which is part of their growth. That then works into your workforce and getting qualified and experienced people, and reduces, of course, your turnover. And if people are, busy doing the right things, a lot of the time it reduces your misconduct and so forth as well. I do think with this point, though, the other part of this as well is understanding your employee group, and I think some of the things that will come out going forward are around very much some of the HR issues that are associated with employment checks and our capability of our team. Customer-centric, and everybody is talking about this, of course, but, complaints management is one bit, but, I think part of that as well is, the consumer choice and how do you sustain that model and provide value. And value doesn't always mean that, it's what you pay for, it's what you perceive to be value. So, putting that clear benchmark of what we want to be famous for allows you to set that value. And compliance, and I think with this perspective, the regulators are getting, I suppose, a lot more engaged as we're seeing a lot more sanctioned homes about it. This is part of getting ahead of the game and making sure that you're ready. And as we all know, we should be doing this sort of, these things every day, but often we don't put ourselves in a position where we readily have the information that's available about the good work we're doing.
I might just jump in here in terms of the context of what I think are the three key messages or core focus that are going to come out of the final report of the Banking Royal Commission. I think probably they're going to be three simple messages. One, institutions have to obey the law, and as a corollary of that, regulators have to get better at enforcing the law. So that sort of picks up both the compliance and the quality of safety points on that slide. The second point, and this picks up quite a lot of what we've already talked about, Jamie's already talked about, and that is the question of should we. In other words, it's what are the community expectations? It's not good enough simply to hide behind the fact that we're obeying the law and that's the end of the matter. A big change that's come through as a result of the Banking Royal Commission, I think it's ultimately about the world we're living in, the impact of the digital revolution, is organisations are being expected to be very clear about what are community expectations and how are we as an organisation, we as a board, going to be confident we're fulfilling them. So that's number one, obey the law. Number two, should we? And of course, the should we on this slide links to both the customer centricity and workforce and culture. And then the third core point is the whole question about how can boards who are ultimately responsible for the governance and management teams have confidence that they're fulfilling those responsibilities. And frankly, given the complexity of these businesses, the only way they can do that is to have real confidence that they've got robust systems and processes, that the organisation understands them, and as a result of that, they know what controls they need and they can target their controls to the areas of greatest risk. Right? And that of course fits nearly all the components of that slide. So, just to reinforce those three key points that I'm sure are going to in turn influence the thinking of your Royal Commission: obey the law, ask the should we question, and then are your systems and processes up to the expectations that is set for governance in 2019.
Thanks, Hugh. And I think that's important because a lot of the questions that we've been talking about with various providers at the moment is, not only do you meet the standards, but what does that mean from, the expectations of a general community? So, and that's another test on top of things, isn't it? Just to reiterate a few of these points, and we wanted to leave a little bit more time for questions as well, but, I think some three maybe key points from here is that, you probably can't do this alone. You need to get advice. There's good advice out there. You need dedicated people to assist and work on this. I suppose the other part from us as well is, manage the communications internally with your team and make sure that you've got the what do we want to be famous for component well sorted, so you understand that well. And then I think the third from me as well is to really understand your data and your business and what's going on at a grassroots level, and have an open approach where you're prepared to say, well, look, we know we've got issues, but we're working on it, and this is our clinical governance that's going to change the future of care. And that leads a vision that helps your team want to follow you post that time. I'll hand over to Sean.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, now it's over to our audience. We would welcome people now to send through your questions and comments as well. They'll come through on the tablet in front of me, and we'll be able to respond to them as they come through. But as we're waiting for those questions, I guess I'll just put it to the panel. Beginning with the end in mind, I think is a great way to approach this. As an industry, LASA's put forward the proposition that what we actually want is a high-performing, respected and sustainable aged care system. So that's providers, consumers, regulators, government and others, and that system delivers accessible, affordable, quality care and services for older Australians. So that's our vision for the industry. How do you see that then being articulated and I guess interpreted by individual providers? Because I think in the slides you were suggesting that you could have a defensive response, you could have a proactive response. I guess your experiences in other forums, how has that been interpreted at the provider level or at the organisational level?
Well, again, it obviously goes to culture, and you can't divorce it from your own views about what's appropriate in these sort of circumstances. And at the end of the day, I think there's no substitute for demonstrating to everyone, including the Commission, that you care, both as an individual, as a senior individual in the organisation, and as an organisation overall. I mean, time and time again, where individuals have come unstuck is basically because they've been seen patently to be arrogant and out of touch. And there are many other factors, not being prepared, not being on your brief, just being rude, frankly. But at the end of the day, I think in all things in life, there's no substitute for demonstrating you care. And presumably, I mean, in some ways, you can argue about whether that comes easier in different industries, you know, and I'm sure there'll be lots of cynics about banking, you know, on this call. But, you know, the obvious point is that you guys are in the care industry, so presumably it does come easier for you guys. But again, you know, the heat of the moment, you know, can generate funny results, obviously. This is stressful. It is an environment that many people aren't, you know, have had no experience in before. So again, I just can't emphasise enough that those organisations and individuals who did best were those who genuinely came across as human, you know, and not trying to be bloody perfect, right? Being realistic, not trying to be overly negative, right? But equally not you know, just wanting to care, wanting to do something about it.
Yeah, I think the point that was made earlier, that no system is perfect. And I think acknowledging that, and again, reflecting on what we've seen play out in the Banking Royal Commission, coming to that process with a genuine purpose to inquire into what's gone wrong and what do we learn from that and how do we make sure those things don't happen again, or and in addition to that, how do we do things even better? I think that's certainly what we're encouraging.
And there's such a balance here, right? Because it's easy to just focus on what's gone wrong, and not focus on all the positives as well, right? So it's such a finely tuned balance here, because you know, obviously there are some things that have gone wrong, but I know from the experience of my own mother, there are lots of things that are going really well. And just getting that balance right is fundamental.
And I think a point that was raised earlier too is, for want of a better term, the optics of how you're communicating. How, you know, there's a fine line between being very authentic versus being interpreted as being disingenuous.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, and the disingenuous stuff, people can see straight away, right? I think the other key point is that a lot of this is about community expectations changing, right? There are a different set of expectations in 2019 about aged care than there were in 2009. Full stop, right? Absolutely full stop.
Yep.
And there are lots of different reasons for that. One is the population's ageing, so it's more in people's face. You know, I think a big part of it is about the digital age, social media, and all of those influences, right? And so I think it's a fair point for people to keep on making that expectations are changing, and we're committed to moving in step with those changing expectations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Keep your questions coming through. I've got one here, which is a really useful question for our audience, because as you'd appreciate, our industry is made up of a rich diversity of organisations. Some are very large, some are very small, some not-for-profit, for-profit, some run by the governments, local councils and state governments. There's a question here, what does this all mean for the small providers? You know, the ones that are unlikely to be able to afford, you know, setting up a program management office or having legal representation. I mean, you know, what can they do practically? What does it mean for them?
Yeah. Look, I think, you know, and that is a real challenge as well. But, you know, when we look at how care is provided across different settings, and I suppose it's, you know, very much some of those concepts of, you know, asking the questions around what's going on and making sure you're connected to, you know, those key concepts of how do we provide better care, how do we become a learning organisation. Sometimes it's, you know, in some cases a little easier because with smaller organisations you can step through that thing that we referred to as the permafrost layer of everything being fine. You can actually be in the grassroots of the business and know what's going on. I think that's important because it allows you to also react more quickly and move things in a way that, can be more consumer focused and more recognising of the changing ways that the standards are asking for care to be provided now. So there are certainly some challenges there, and maybe that is part of, what needs to happen going forward is some of that, and we're hearing this across the industry in different places as well, where those smaller providers are joining up and comparing notes more regularly and making sure that they're, in touch with each other around those type of changes that are effective and learning from each other. Part of this is becoming a learning organisation, I think, as well.
I think that's right, Jamie, and I guess the point that was made earlier around every organisation is going through the effort to put forward to produce all this information around issues of substandard care or complaints, but also the line of inquiry from the Royal Commission is also about, well, what have you done to improve quality? Where do you think we could look to find improvements in the system in the broadest sense?
Yep.
And so using that then as a mechanism for boards and executive teams to sit down and have that inquiry into their own business, I think it is that learning opportunity.
Yep.
Yeah. We'll again request more questions coming through, but whilst we're waiting for some more, I took kind of three kind of lines of activity that or things that need to be managed through the process over the coming 12 months, and there's obviously something about looking after the staff. So supports for your staff, managing your stakeholders, and this is working with residents or clients, their families, carers, but also the wider community. And then I think flowing from both of those comes how you're managing the reputation of your organisation, whilst there is this maelstrom of public scrutiny around the whole industry. So if we just take that first one around supporting your staff, well, one of the things that was mentioned was a pulse survey.
Yep.
It'd be good just to see if there's any practical examples of other organisations, perhaps in the banking sector, what they did to support their frontline staff through a process of significant scrutiny.
Yeah, and I think the key was really about ongoing, straightforward communication. These are big organisations. So depend effectively on mass internal communication. So again, none of this is rocket science. Get on the front foot, be proactive, tell the truth, right? Don't sugarcoat it. But there's a balance. Equally don't be overly defensive. And one of the things I like to say is that these businesses are about rowing science, not rocket science. Right? That it's about getting everyone in the boat, heading in the same direction, know where they're going, and working on getting every stroke better, right? And if you combine that thought with the thought that a lot of this is actually about community expectations changing, right, and recognising that, then I think that's sort of a template for how to engage staff. And again, I've said a couple of times, this is a human exercise. Just remember that, and probably above all, just keep it bloody simple if you can.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns that has been raised with us, through our members, is the impact on their frontline staff. That these are people that every day get up, get out of bed, and go to work with the intention to deliver the best possible care they can, and sometimes in difficult and trying circumstances. Yet you've got a mainstream media that's telling stories that are reflecting all bad experiences, and those staff can feel undervalued or under a lot of scrutiny. I mean, have you seen any organisations putting in place specific measures to support their staff through that? Through that process?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's been some extra investment in those sort of classic staff care, staff hotline sorts of things. But I think it comes back a little bit to the point that this whole question of systems and processes, right? Because, the reality is that in any population of people, there's going to be a bell curve, right? There are going to be some fantastic people. They're going to be most of us in the middle, and they're going to be a couple at the extreme end, right? And those at the extreme end, if they want to do damage, they will do damage pretty well regardless, right? And it's just life. And again, it comes back to, giving context both to staff and to the community generally about, we're not God, right? We're going to get hit by rogue elements as well. Okay. Equally, one of the core elements of all management is that you're responsible for how the whole system works and thinking about the system and actually working hard at thinking about the systems and processes and what the controls are. Now, that's very sort of, management theory, PwC speaky, right? But it is where the world's going. And I think it's a part too of organisations explaining to the Royal Commission, explaining to government that they're not operating in a vacuum and things that they're looking for assistance to help in that. And, and some of their systems and processes are complicated by shitty regulation, right, and complexity and all of those problems. And again, I mean, it comes back to that earlier point about, when you look at the banking Royal Commission, those institutions that have done best have definitely been those that have demonstrated they're more thoughtful, right? That they're not perfect, that they're thinking about this in a holistic way and understanding it and really trying to drive the system and process in which they operate better. Now, I have absolute sympathy for all the smaller institutions who are saying, easy for a guy like you who works in a different industry with bigger clients and all that sort of stuff. Okay, but it is a little bit again this point about community expectations are changing, right? And how within the confines you have do you edge yourself closer in that direction?
But I think what you also there are universal principles that it doesn't matter the size of your organisation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So just on that around different size organisations, there's a question here about do you think that a standalone facility with 55 beds that's never had a non-compliance in the last 5 years, that has been requested, has been invited to make a submission, should they actually make a submission? A Royal Commission's invited you. You're not being compelled to produce evidence. And this is a question that's come up a few times. But I guess I'd take your views from your experience in the Banking Royal Commission. Would you recommend, if you've been invited to make a submission, that you don't?
Look, it's obviously very hard to answer that question in the abstract, right, without knowing specifics of everyone's cases, right? So I'd hate to answer this in a way that someone said, well, PwC said.
Yeah.
Right. Having said that, my instinct would be, in this case, more is better, right? And to take up the opportunity. Again, I can't stress enough, a lot of this is about signalling, right? And, the willingness to engage is a signal about seriousness, about good intent, right? Now, don't be naive about that. But net, I'd be, without knowing specific cases, I'd be veering towards yes. I don't know whether you've got comments, Jamie?
Look, I certainly agree. The reason that we have a Royal Commission is to get a perspective on what's going on in the industry. So what a perfect opportunity to, give a different perspective of and potentially if we're getting this right in some way, we've got a residential service that's well connected to the community. Now, a small provider could be that exemplar. So why not?
Yeah.
I think it'll value add.
I think the other thing is too, right, that in the public debate, the big institutions tend to dominate stuff, right? This is, in a sense, quite a democratic process and giving people, institutions who wouldn't normally be heard, the opportunity to be heard. And I think that's a good thing, right? And frankly, was part of the reason why I was always supportive of that sort of approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go back to the FAQs that the Royal Commission's released, although it says it is an invitation, they also then say, by the way, we do have powers that could compel you to provide this information. So I think that's worth noting. Yep. I think second point, though, was also what you mentioned early on, is that the tone was set in the Banking Royal Commission with some of the responses or lack thereof from some of the players, and that then can play out in various ways throughout the Royal Commission process. And then I think the third point, coming back to what you were saying, Jamie, is if nothing else, you're getting a snapshot of your business in absolute detail that you should reflect upon in order to really get to know your business and work out, well, if we would need to do things differently, where do we start and what would we focus on? And then I think the fourth thing I'd say is that in the responses that have been requested from providers, it's not just about non-compliance. There's a whole range of other questions there that open up the opportunity to say, well, if we had our druthers, this is what we would do differently. Because the legislation compels us against this, or there's other constraints in the system, how we'd like to work with the acute system. So it's the opportunity for the providers to have their say around what they'd like to see change. And
that was a much broader invitation for your industry that was for banking. There was basically none of that in the initial rounds of the request to the banks. I suppose the other thing too is the mere fact the Royal Commission's being held means that everyone in the industry is now on notice, right? The very fact it's called meant that the standard is permanently raised, right? And whether you respond or not, you've got to think about what you know, not only what does that mean for me, but you know, if things did go wrong, how could I actually justify what we've done henceforth?
Yeah. We'll keep that call coming for further questions, but I want to get back to that point. So we talked about staff supports, stakeholder engagement. Now, obviously, this is fundamental. So supporting residents and clients, because they're having this service, they're hearing all these stories happening out there in the mainstream media. It's interesting, my discussions with many of our members and particularly with their residents and clients is the story I get more and more is, isn't it terrible what's happening in aged care? I'm so glad it's not happening here. And that's what I hear repeatedly from the people receiving the care and the services. So being able to support them and also their carers and their families, but also more broadly the community and in particular media, local media and mainstream. Any insights or thoughts about how you do that well?
Do you want to go, or I'm happy to go?
Yeah, no, I think, look, there's some openness there again, I think, and part of, the concept of trust. I often used to sit around a table with a group of people, if they've all got their heads down and not engaging, you probably got the discussion wrong. I think, part of building trust is engaging people and investing in them. And as part of engaging the community, you need to invest in the community and you need to provide a point in time in which they can feel like they're involved in changing the way that you provide a service, because then they own it. So, our thoughts in this space are around, getting to know and embedding in community involvement through volunteers and all the things that we do, but make it realistic and be open and transparent and involve people in enabling that change, and then you'll start to connect a little bit more. And then, from an internal perspective, I think it's part of, and I won't profess to be any media expert for sure, but certainly what I know has worked in large organisations that I've had teams in as well is that you've got to get ahead of the game with the media and the information you're putting it out. So you almost got to have a blanket approach. So there's more easier information that you've got, and people, you're in front of them, can connect with you, so they can ask questions and they can go through some of those issues they're having. Because anything you're going to get on Four Corners or otherwise is only one way of feed. So I have those open forums not only with your staff but the community as well.
Hugh, anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, my 87-year-old mum has been in a retirement setting now for about 18 months and generally had a great experience. I'm certainly fascinated to see what communication she or /we are going to get about this. Yeah. I'm just intrigued to see, are they going to get on the front foot and communicate? And I would have thought that would be a good thing, and I wouldn't have thought it's so hard to do. I think the media thing is trickier. Probably in this, I'd be a bit more conservative than Jamie and not necessarily be courting it unless I really thought there was a strong need for it. I think it's in a lot of this stuff, deeds can speak a lot more than words. But I'd certainly be thinking about, what are you telling the residents and what are you telling their families, right? And it doesn't have to be over the top, but, you know, it's not rocket science.
No, and I think communicating, well, you probably couldn't over-communicate in this environment, I'd suggest, is probably a good place to start. Look, we'll put out a final call for questions. But one other thing, I thought I would just touch on the role of boards. And again, getting back to the diversity of types of organisations. Any thoughts around, you know, if we have any directors or chairs in the webinar today, what should they be asking from their executives with regards to the Royal Commission?
Yep. Well, the obvious perspective is they're the people who are ultimately accountable under the law. Right? And there's no doubt that some of the biggest implications from the Banking Royal Commission are about changes in governance, not just across banking, but actually across the whole industry. Or sorry, all industry, right? I mean, particularly in the context of listed entities, but more generally. And I actually think that the single biggest implication of the Banking Royal Commission is how it's going to change board behaviour, right? And that's going to play out for a long time. To answer your specific question, you know, chairmen and boards need to be thinking hard about the fact that they're ultimately accountable, right? And you know, what are they doing to be able to both discharge that properly and to be seen to be discharging that properly in the expectations of 2019. The last point I make, and we've talked about trust, is it's always worth remembering that too much trust is just as bad as too little trust, right? And, you know, the classic issue is, what do we teach our 6-year-old kids, right? Beware of strangers. And if you look at some of the highest profile failures exposed by the Royal Commission, it's actually because boards trusted management too much, right? And in my experience, actually, the people that I've most respected in my career have been those who tended not to trust people, right? Because they knew to be sure of something, you've got to ask the hard questions.
Yeah.
And you know, that's not a disease that's unique to banking.
Right.
Okay.
Good. Thank you, Hugh. Look, one last question, and then we'll wrap up. There's a question here about what insights do we have around the balance of focus in the Royal Commission between residential care and home care? I mean, Jamie, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, the initial questions that have come out would appear to be more residentially based at the moment. Although, you know, when we reflect on the terms of reference, it covers all areas.
Yep.
I assume at the moment they're picking off the juicy bits, for want of better words, and having a look at that first. But it is connected, and that's part of what we need to look at in making the system work. We've got to look at all aspects of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, can I jump in and say, I hope to hell that somehow there is a much bigger focus on home care. You know, I have seen some terrible instances recently of elder abuse in that context. I think there's a powder keg of concern out there. As always, there's some great stuff, but there's also some terrible stuff. Yeah. And again, in terms of organisations thinking strategically about holistic responses, then in my mind, that, you know, I really do hope from personal perspective that this can be a focus of the Royal Commission.
Yeah, and I mean, the Commission will focus on it. I mean, it's basically all approved providers will be asked to respond and will be, I guess, in the spotlight, both home care, residential care, you know, Commonwealth Home Support. Yeah. I would suggest even, you know, Veterans Affairs and others. So, look, I'll just make a couple of closing comments before we wrap up. Look, just in terms of what's next, we know that the preliminary hearing, the directions hearing, will happen on the 18th of January in Adelaide. That'll set basically the program of work for the Commission. And they have mentioned that February, March, there'll be the first witness hearings also conducted in Adelaide. And many of you on the webinar will know that the interim report is due on October 2019, with the final report due in April 2020. I'd just like to make I guess, a closing comment around the role of the media. Now, they're obviously going to play a very important role in reporting the process and the findings to the community. And there is really, from the announcement of the Royal Commission when the Prime Minister fronted up to the press, and his words were that there are going to be some very bruising stories that will emerge from this process. And I think that's something for us all to be cognizant of, and we've touched on that to some part here in the conversation today. Recently, the ABC reported, in drawing a parallel between the Banking Royal Commission and the upcoming Aged Care Royal Commission, about some of the things that we might look to expect around the actual process and how those stories might play out. And I think it's beholden upon all of us to be cognizant of that and ensure that we're putting in place the right supports for our residents and our clients, also for their families and carers, and for all of your staff as well. Just in closing, let me just reiterate some of the key points that we've covered off previously. I mean, this is uncharted waters for our industry. I mean, this is a historical moment for aged services in the country. And as we said previously, the community interest and scrutiny is going to be extremely high. But notwithstanding that, the outcome here that we all want is to make the aged care system better. And it's beholden upon everybody in the industry to work towards that outcome. And in part, that will be requiring all of us to actually inquire into what is best for older Australians, the growing number of older Australians, and those older Australians with changing needs and expectations. And in part, that will actually compel us to stop advocating for certain elements of the system and to start inquiring into the whole system can work better together. And just in closing, as our members would know, it's our role as your peak body to be here to support your members, our members, through this process to the best of our ability. So having said that, let me say thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your support. I'd like to thank our panellists for your insights through the process and drawing parallels with the Banking Royal Commission. And on that note, thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing our members again soon. Bye for now.